Yeah, I think when you look at public sector pensions, I mean, they do serve an incredibly vital role for those employees who deliver services to the citizens in their locality and their state. So it's certainly important to maintain them and to help bolster them, because it has cascading effects, domino effects to other people in the and especially the economy.
Absolutely. And one of the other things we know from some of the research we've done, we asked the American people, because they've told us there is a retirement savings crisis. So we've asked them, well, what would you do if you could to change, be ready to deal with the crisis? What's really interesting, the first thing everybody says is, I'm going to work as long as I can. Yeah. I'm going to stay with my current employer and work as long as I can. If not, I'll find another job and work in retirement. The next thing they tell us is they'll cut back on spending when they retire. And then the third thing is, we ask them, well, could you save an additional 1 to 4% or 5%? And about half of the people said they could do that. Then we asked them, could you go more than 5%? And only about 29 or 30% of the people said that they could do that. So, you're really seeing a drop-off in terms of that, being able to save more. But that's really what we have to work towards doing, because ultimately, from an economic point of view, and there was a study that McKinsey did, and they were looking at baby boomers. And they said, well, what's the economic impact if baby boomers, instead of working longer, were to just retire and cut back their spending? And the impact that will have on our economy, especially as we continue to age, will be really significant. It will be a downgrade, whereas if they continue to work, and again, one of the interesting things in our survey on women, to get back to that, is one of the things we've seen that I didn't expect to see was this much higher percentage of women between 55 and 65 staying in the workforce. The reality of it is, when you look at it, since the baby boomer women turned 55, they have stayed in the workforce at levels we have never seen before. And so where it was about 50% of the people were working at that age rate between 55 and 65. Before that, today it's in the high 60s, the low 70s.
Yeah, I think
so. That's a real significant piece. But the problem with that is, some women are going to face shocks from either their own health, but probably more likely the health of their parents or the health of a spouse, and they might have to pull out of the workforce sooner than what they would like to improve their own economic situation to take care of those individuals. And that just has a real significant cost to women too.
Yeah, I think when I look at my own circumstances, I enjoy working. I want to continue working, and I'm not sure that people really process that at an early age. I mean, I had the luxury of being in this industry since I started working. So I've been thinking about retirement since I was 22 years old, and thinking about that, having that long-term vision. Many Americans don't necessarily have that. So I think it's about kind of changing the conversation, and certainly your study and conferences like this help to kind of get that going. I wanted to shift gears slightly, because we've talked a little bit about the auto escalation and the defaulting people in. Pension Protection Act is now 10 years old. Mm-hmm. Happy birthday.
Yep.
And I know that I think there was a celebration recently on the 10 years, or maybe
yes.
There's one coming up, I don't know. I didn't get the invitation. But I wanted to get your perspective on PPA 06, because it's got some different pieces to it that have an impact to defined benefit plans as well as defined contribution plans.
Are you sure you weren't in the audience? I was on the panel at that presentation.
I wish if I were, I was in the back.
Because I was the person raising the defined benefit issue.
I was in the parking lot.
Okay. Actually, the Chamber of Commerce had a dialogue, and they brought back people who worked on the congressional staff when PPA was passed. And I worked for a congressman at the time who was on the Ways and Means Committee, so I wasn't on the committee staff. It was very interesting that structure still kind of came about. When it came to putting in the panel and having them talk, I was the last one they turned to, because I didn't work on the committee of jurisdiction. I worked for an individual member. But what the Pension Protection Act gave us some tools to help make defined contribution plans better and more effective for everyone by auto escalation, auto enrollment. And set some guidelines for that, made employers more comfortable with that. But at the same time, one of the things they did, and actually my boss at the time was very much opposed to the PPA and actually voted against it because of what it was going to do to defined benefit plans. The concern really was more with the PBGC solvency and making sure that that was there to guarantee the benefits. And to do that, one of the ways that Congress tried to get that done was to say to the private sector public pension, let me go through that. One of the ways that Congress was able to get that done was to say to the private sector defined benefit plans, you're going to have to fund your liabilities in your pension plans a lot sooner. And if you don't, if something happens and investments don't go as you want, you're going to fund those changes in 7 years. And PPA passed in 2006, didn't take effect until 2009. Now we all know what happened in 2008, 2009. The financial markets collapsed in many ways. One of the first things my boss was doing at the end of 2008 was pushing very hard to change some of those rules. And in fact, the reality of it is, since Congress passed these rules that made it more stringent to fund defined benefit plans in the private sector, they have gone back 6 times and changed and eased the rules. One of the things that the private sector employers have to do, like now public plans, is they've got to put the unfunded liability on their balance sheet. And the funding process now in the private sector sort of follows what that marketplace determination is. And so employers were going to see huge swings in how much money they'd have to put into their pension plan each year. And that isn't good for business. And so that's one of the reasons why they were concerned. And one of the things that we've seen in the private sector is we saw a distinct acceleration of freezing of private sector defined benefit plans among the largest corporations in the United States. So much so that today, only roughly about 100 or so of the Fortune 500 offer DB plans to their workforce in some way, shape, or form.
But we know from reading surveys that people like that DB feature. And so now we're kind of coming full circle and looking for ways to annuitize, if that's the right word, either inside the plan or outside the plan, a portion or all of those balances. So to your earlier point, it's interesting how things kind of come full circle and perhaps a more measured approach tends to work itself out better over the long period of time.
It can over a long period of time. The one difference, though, is there's something about the DB plan, that the way the DB plan is able to pull together the risk. In essence, the move to freeze a DB plan or shift people to defined contribution plans, what that has really done is it shifted a lot of the risk to the individuals. And most individuals, number one, have a hard time investing their dollars and doing that right. Target date funds help a lot, but individuals still get concerned and panic. We just saw it with the Brexit issue, where a lot of people probably went in, were calling up their financial firms and hearing, oh, don't move yet, but some people were still too concerned, and they did. And so we see that in terms of people sometimes making the wrong choice. But now, when it comes to lifetime income, you're asking somebody to become your own actuary. And like you, I started in the retirement business. I actually started off trying to study to be an actuary. And I did it for about 3 years and decided this is hard stuff.
It is hard, real hard.
It's hard to get that level and understand it. And to ask the average American to understand how much I'm going to live. So the DB plan pulls all of that. And we've done some economic studies that show, from the defined benefit perspective, where you pool the longevity risk, you pool the investment management, you actually can deliver the same amount of retirement income for roughly half the cost. So, why we can put these DB components into defined contribution plans, it does have a cost. And it means that people will get less income for each dollar they put away.
Yeah, it'd just be nice to have a national conversation about all these different arrangements and how they could work. Because I think to your earlier point, there's a lack of education I think people are inherently smart. They're pursuing their own self-interest, but at the same time, they're juggling so many different things that you're not thinking about retirement until it's too late. So, and then you've got the whole behavioral aspect of it, that people just inherently are thinking about themselves today and not in the future.
Not in the future, absolutely.
Diane Oakley, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you come back on the show, and I hope you enjoy Coeur d'Alene.
I do too.
Thank you.